with Iain Stewart, Professor Iain Stewart, we will have a kind of a keynote discussion between himself and myself around the topic of this evening's webinar, which is the particular role that individuals can play in handling an environment and climate emergency like we are in. We will follow that by having a specific discussion about the Citizens' Assembly and its role in the carbon plan process. And we will make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and answers from you all at that stage. And of course, you can make that clear in the chat all the way through as well. And we'll finish with some next steps. But I would just like to appreciate all of you for engaging with us this evening and in the process. That's what's going to make it work. So we do appreciate you logging on at this time of day and being available and hopefully asking questions and receiving some decent answers in the course of the next hour. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Patrick. So if I might, I'm going to pick up on the background of the Devon Climate Emergency and how it came about as a partnership. So, but before I do that, actually, we did want to run a quick poll just to see who's in the room, get a bit of a flavour of who has joined us tonight.
Oh, Emily, I think I forgot to, wasn't I supposed to mention that we were going to be recording tonight's webinar as well? So
yes, that's
I'd like to ask everybody's permission for that. Yeah, so just to let you all know about that too. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, well remembered there, Patrick. So actually, Doug, can I ask you to start the poll because having technical issues. Brilliant, thank you. So just to see who's in the room tonight and what your engagement already is. Brilliant, so most people there have voted, one or two more still to vote. I'll end the poll now, and then we can share the results. So quite an engaged group in the room tonight, with 58% of people already involved in a community organisation working in climate change issues. So that's really encouraging. We're going to need your support to get to net zero. And also great to see lots of people who are not already involved in groups, but might have a personal interest in the room. So we've got one more question that we'd like to ask you. So how do you feel you're currently able to effectively reduce your environmental impact? Okay, so that's most people in the room. I think there's two of you haven't voted, but you're not obliged to. So we'll end polling and share the results. So quite a few people understandably feeling that they could be doing more, and a few people feeling they're unable to for whichever reasons. So I think a good demonstration that everyone feels greater support's needed, and we all need to collectively be clear on what we can be doing. Well, hopefully this evening will add to that conversation. So to introduce the Devon Climate Emergency Partnership, the overarching goal is to create a resilient net zero carbon Devon where people and nature thrive, and there are three objectives to achieve that. So reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2050 at the latest, and so that means that any emissions would be balanced by things like trees drawing down emissions, so that overall we wouldn't be making any additions to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And to improve the resilience of Devon's environment, we know that we are going to have further climate change. Some is already inevitable, and so we need to improve the resilience to Devon's environment of things like floods, and prepare communities for a warmer world. The partnership has a broad range of organisations from all local authorities in Devon, including Torbay and Plymouth, as well as environmental organisations such as the Wildlife Trust and emergency response organisations in Devon. The structure of the partnership is a response group that makes strategic decisions with CEO and director level individuals from those partner organisations, supported by a tactical group where officers and staff within those organisations can meet to share updates and share learnings. And one of the first things they did was develop a Devon Climate Declaration, which declared an emergency, a climate emergency, and outlined commitments for the organisations to reduce their own emissions and support asking for the resources and policy needed from national government, as well as the development of plans to tackle the emergency. There's two primary work streams: one, mitigation to reduce the emissions from Devon, and that's led by the Net Zero Task Force, chaired by Patrick Devine-Wright, and they have produced the Interim Devon Carbon Plan that we're presenting you tonight. And there's an adaptation stream that helps prepare communities for a warmer world, and that's actually done on a regional basis, working with Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, the climate impacts group that is, and producing a Devon adaptation plan. So the Interim Devon Carbon Plan that we're presenting to you tonight went through an evidence gathering phase. It's a plan for everyone, so we wanted to gather evidence widely. So there was a call for evidence with almost 900 submissions from the public, and as well as a youth parliament that fed into the process, and thematic hearings of roundtable meetings of experts from across different fields such as built environment, food, land and sea, etc. And those ideas were gathered up to produce the plan. Originally, we had hoped to hold a citizens' assembly prior to publishing the plan, but due to the pandemic, that's not been possible. So we've taken the route of producing this Interim Devon Carbon Plan, which presents actions on ideas that we think are broadly publicly acceptable, and also outlines issues that ought to have further deliberation by a citizens' assembly. And we'll say a bit more about the citizens' assembly later, but that is due to be held next year, and a revised plan with additional detail will be published after that. So the plan focuses on strategic issues, and it also nests with national plans and will be given further detail as appropriate locally in district and community plans. So the plan describes what needs to be done to reach net zero, as well as the trajectory of emissions reductions to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest, and indicates the costs that this might involve, as well as the opportunities and the co-benefits for things such as health that we can also achieve in the process. We want to hear your opinion in the consultation process on what the date for net zero ought to be, but the plan outlines some of the challenges in achieving this. For example, obviously some legislation is set nationally, so if we try to decarbonise ahead of the national target locally, then we wouldn't be able to make laws to enforce some of those things. But yeah, do let us know what you think about the date in the consultation. So as I said, We indicate the cost of achieving net zero, and we are very clear that we don't have the current resources that we need to implement the plan. Additional resources will be needed, but we indicate the funding status of the different actions and where the funding might come from, where this is known, and also the opportunities that are presented to address these issues. For example, investment opportunities or potentials for co-benefits. We recognise Devon's geography. It is a predominantly rural county, but we do have 3 major urban areas, Torbay, Plymouth and Exeter, and the challenges will vary depending on where in Devon you are, and as will the opportunities, and some behaviours will be easier, for instance, in towns. So we do indicate the geography where this is quite specific for some actions. So some of the co-benefits that are really clear coming through are, for instance, for health and well-being, to reduce fuel poverty, for more active lifestyles and for healthier diets, and that will help the NHS, as well as for our prosperity through energy security and boosting our local economy, as well as providing opportunities for jobs, skills and study. And in increasing the resilience, there's lots of benefits for biodiversity and reducing flood risk, as well as air and water quality and green space.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. And it's encouraging to see lots of questions firing in on the chat already, which is really, really good. So we've reached that time in the webinar where we're going to hand over for this, well, it's not quite a normal keynote, it's more of a discussion, but I'd certainly like to ask Professor Iain Stewart to make some opening remarks now on the theme of what individuals can do in order to try and tackle the climate emergency and address the net zero challenge. Over to you, Iain.
Thanks, Patrick. I think one of the big challenges we have in the whole climate change, global heating kind of agenda really is how we connect those global changes that we see from the science and how we bring it down with granularity to what happens in the local. And it's a really tough thing. So some aspects of the climate emergency can only be dealt with at scale, at huge scale, at the international scale and at the national scale. And I think that almost certainly leads to this kind of feeling of dissonance and disconnection at the local scale, at the scale of, you know, somewhere like Devon or Exeter, Plymouth or something like that, because that feeling of sort of helplessness really, of the overwhelming scale of the problem and the urgency for many people. And then that sense of being disconnected. So I think that we've already seen, I've just been noticed in the chat, several people saying, you know, but system change, and clearly no one who understands this problem kind of reduces the feeling that we need to have big scale changes happening. The question then is how are those enabled and affected? And I think that's where we start to bring it down to the local and to the individual, because at the end of the day, many of the changes will be behavioral changes. There'll be mindset changes. There'll be changes that start to have to filter up to our kind of civic leaders and our politicians and our decision makers and our business leaders and things like that. And I think without that feeling that the grassroots is really pushing for this, that's not going to happen. The politicians will have a way out, etc. So I think that it's a balancing act really, because there are things that the individual can do. There are things we can all do, and we could have that discussion about what each of us are doing and how we're enabling that. But the real power that we've got is giving the courage to those above us to go boldly into some of these sometimes quite unpalatable, sometimes quite tricky, long-term decisions that will have a short-term cost, for example. And that's something that no one likes to do, in particular politicians. So I think it's about balancing it all out between those things.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with you there, Iain. I think there's a lot of emphasis upon behavioral change in the discourse around what individuals could or should be doing. And I think this is a legacy of you know, 2 decades of kind of putting it out to the public, you know, whether are you doing your bit or not, and then generally focusing on some fairly trivial behavioral changes, which,
Yeah.
okay, when it's accumulated to everybody in society, sure, there are large scale consequences of that, but in and of itself, each of those individual actions is relatively small. So how do we balance the emphasis upon behavioral change with structural change? And I think that's what's really changed over the last couple of years. And I really see the rise of social movements as important here. And that's something that individuals can take part in collective actions, as you said, to try and send a clear signal to representative policymakers and decision makers of all kinds that actually there is a groundswell of opinion. It maybe in some ways the public is ahead of leaders in some of these senses, but unless they get a clear signal about that, the short-termism of electoral cycles maybe is not likely to make them to take courageous actions, as you said. So
I think the other thing that I'd throw in there as well is we talk about the individual as if we're all equal. I mean,
yeah,
different individuals have different capabilities and responsibilities, and so as you know, the Paris Climate Agreement has got this thing about principles of equity around common but differentiated capabilities and responsibilities. But I think that works at the local level as well. In other words, there are different levels of equity, of fairness. You know, some people are in more, you know, that are suffering from climate change more, but equally the responsibility. You know, the big emitters are, you know, generally the more affluent amongst us, those who travel, people like myself and you, Patrick, that used to be flying around the world talking about these kind of things.
yeah,
And then that idea of capability, those who can change. So, you know, in Devon, we have certain aspects that other places don't. You know, Dartmoor and Peatlands, for example, we don't have other aspects that other places do. And it's the same with individuals. So I think I think sometimes people feel pushed upon to be told you're always having to do something. They are kind of say, well, I'm trying, I'm doing things. Not everyone has to make the same changes. Those who are the biggest emitters should be doing the most. And that's one thing I think we need to try to get the message across.
yeah, it's interesting. About 15-20 years ago, there was a suggestion to introduce something like personal quotas for carbon emissions. It kind of appeared and then disappeared very rapidly, and it's never really come back. But I guess underpinning that equity is some sense that you know, there is a correlation between income and emissions, and therefore, you know, people who are in poorer socioeconomic sections of society may in some ways actually need to increase their consumption in order to have a decent standard of living and to live in warm homes and to have that basic standard that everybody should live with. But the idea that everybody can be entitled to several long haul flights a year to go on holiday, or to run multiple vehicles and have ever larger homes or footprints, you know, we really need to challenge some fundamental things in our society about what are considered to be a good life and a successful life. And you know, our dietary choices are really important in that, and important locally in Devon as well. The consumption of dairy, the consumption of beef, these are really tricky issues that we are going to be looking at over the next year. So yeah,
and I think the other thing is that there's a lot of talk of the just transition, you know, shifting people so people don't lose out. And you know, one of the aspects of that is some of the highest emitters are those people living in rental properties that are really poorly, you know, they're poorly built. They're just shedding heat, but actually they're in no position to do anything about it. So they might be high emitters, but actually the capacity to make anything a change is very low. So I think that we need to look at that across. And the other thing I think is people are very conscious, think of electricity they use, the lights they use, maybe their heat, they see the bills, things like that. They're thinking of their mobility and whether they drive or not. But it's the consumption emissions, you know, the emissions that are related to the things we buy, the things we wear, you know, fashion and things like that, the things that are exported into the Devon from outside, for example. And I think people find it really hard to know what to do about that, how you measure what your carbon footprint is in that kind of context.
Well, I agree. It's, you know, we've started trying to look at this at the university, and the scope 3 emissions, which I think you're just beginning to refer to, absolute nightmare in terms of trying to tie them down and figure out where they are. So I think there is a huge challenge here about even knowing how big the problem is, and just the scale of movement of goods and services across county boundaries and national boundaries is just, it's formidably complex. And yeah, I mean, I think it's been very difficult for us even in the process to really get to grips with that. You know, we've followed metrics and processes which have come down from the national level in the Climate Change Committee, but I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in terms of how that exact accounting procedure is done.
And I think the other thing to throw out to people here, I mean, ironically, probably most of the people on the call are the easy to reach. They're not the hard to reach. They're already kind of connected somehow on this. And I think that one of the aspects is there isn't a one size fits all model for this. I'm involved in the Scottish Climate Assembly, and it's quite very different conversations where some are the same, but there's also some different conversations. We need a conversation for Devon that starts to look at, we're a rural county, but we've got these big urban hubs. You know, it's going to, even within Devon, the solutions are going to be quite complicated.
Yes, and I think what we've tried to do with the plan document is to make that spatial differentiation and social differentiation as clear as possible. So for those people who are listening in, there are tabs on each of the pages in the web version of the document, at least, where you can kind of zoom into what the plan looks like in terms of urban issues, rural issues, coastal issues, settlements of different sizes, different kinds of actors. So we have tried to make it as easy to navigate as possible in order to reflect that distinction because of the nature of the local context that we're dealing with. And it's very, very different from the national picture that the Climate Change Committee has been looking at, for example. And so the context of individual action is so different if people are living in the middle of Plymouth or they're living on the edge of Dartmoor. You know, those are very different contexts in which to think about what individuals can or ought to be doing in order to
I think just that, sorry, Cross, I was just thinking one other thing. I think the COVID situation has transformed the landscape in a number of ways, but one is the way that we perceive these things. So there we can see, for example, how there is actions that have to happen at the government level, in the regional level, and all the rest of it. But actually, people are also very aware that there are levels that have it at the individual, their responsibility, the responsibility to speak out if they see someone doing something inappropriate or not wearing a mask or something. And I think that transfers across to climate change too. There are things you can do as an individual, and people need to start changing at the pace and the capacity they have. And that then puts pressure upwards to drive the things that they have no control over, which are the systemic changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to connect the two, the climate emergency and the pandemic emergency. You know, the idea of a climate emergency has been around for a while now. I think Devon declared, the organizations in Devon declared a climate emergency in the middle of 2019. But is it really shared that much that it's got the same level of urgency as the pandemic? I'm still not really sure that that idea has translated into, as you said, a sense of alarm about whether people are making the right choices in their personal lives, etc. I think that there's still a bit of a way to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are various, as you well know, your work is on behavioural change, but there are end members who are very alarmed or actually don't care much. But most people are in the middle. They're concerned about it in some way. They're not quite sure what they can do. And I think the messy middle is where a lot of the argument is going to be. What can people do? They know about, reusing and recycling, things like that. They know about trying to reduce the car use and mobility and like investing in green energy, changing diet a little bit. But I think it's helping them make those changes. And I think that idea of collective action is real key. How do we mobilize groups of people, whole communities to do this?
Well, one of the things that Devon is strong on are some quite strong networks of community actors. So we've got a community energy network, we've got transition town organizations, etc. Yeah. So, there is that civil society infrastructure there, and it's about building on that and enabling that. But as you said, there's still a lot of structural problems. A lot of the decisions taken by central government, for example, over the last 5 years have not exactly been sympathetic to the plight of community energy initiatives. So I think one of the challenges for us all on this webinar is, Devon trying to forge ahead and do as much as we can, but at the same time, in the face of what sometimes are sympathetic and sometimes quite confusing signals from national policy, that we have to work around. So the political context is important as much as the individual or behavioural context as well.
I'm just thinking of time. I'm not sure how much time we've got. Well, I mean, we're happy, I'm sure, to rabbit on for ages, but how are we doing? I'm looking at Emily here.
I think it's time to move on to the Citizens Assembly.
It felt like the time to move on before we used to start haranguing people.
Yeah, so just to reassure everybody, we are having a Q&A. This isn't going to go on and on and on. We're just going to say a little bit about the Citizens Assembly coming up in terms of the process and the potential topics, and we'd like to get your feedback on that this evening. So I'm assuming most of you on the call will know what a Citizens Assembly is. We've had one at the UK level now already, and there's a Scottish one going on at the moment, and they've been held in other countries. So the key thing about a Citizens Assembly is that it's an attempt to bring individual citizens into the policy making process in a tangible way, and hopefully to have some impact on that policy making. And to the credit of the organisations behind the Devon Climate Emergency process, they recognised at the start that a Citizens Assembly in Devon would be a good way, would be one positive element of that process. Now, not all local authorities in England and the UK have made that decision, so I think it's interesting that Devon has done. It's going to take place sometime around the middle of next year. The idea is that it will be a representative sample of people from all walks of life living in both rural and urban contexts. And we think the number of participants is likely to be around 70 to 80 people. And that's in order to have a sufficient number to be robust and representative, but not to have too many people to make it actually logistically very, very difficult to organize and facilitate discussions at the time, because it will probably be online, subject to all the uncertainties around COVID that we've been talking about. And wearing another hat, I've been working with colleagues in the politics department at the University of Exeter to provide some guidance to the climate emergency partners on this. And I think one of the things that we've learned from previous climate citizens assemblies is that it's very, very difficult to try and turn people into climate change experts in the course of a couple of afternoon sessions or a few weekend discussion times. The variety of issues are so many, and the complexities of the problems are so challenging. So we're thinking of taking a different course of action here, which is to target the contents of the discussions of the Citizens Assembly around the most challenging issues, the most controversial issues. And that's one of the things we try and signal in the report, because it's already become clear from the expert hearings and the public call for evidence that there are large differences of opinion around certain things. So I'm going to hand over to Emily now, I think, to take us through some of the things that we've identified already as being potential topics that the Citizens Assembly could get their teeth into when it happens towards the middle of next year. So over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And these issues are flagged up in the report, so you should be able to see on the website quite clearly where it says an opportunity for discussion by the Citizens Assembly, and gives you a bit more detail to ground these in. But some of the issues and opportunities are how should Devon's landscapes evolve in ways that positively support achieving net zero and are beneficial to their special qualities. We have quite a number of nationally and internationally recognised landscapes of significance and a beautiful county. So this is a very important question. So to what extent would the use of financial mechanisms be acceptable to Devon citizens to help discourage activities that generate emissions and to fund emissions reductions? So the public call for evidence flagged up a number of different suggestions. For example, some people wanted council tax put up to collect money to spend on tackling climate change. Obviously, that's quite a controversial suggestion. So we think that citizens ought to have some say on that. Onshore wind energy is again another controversial topic. So how can tensions between the support for onshore wind in theory and practice be reduced? To what extent should financial incentives and legislation be used to accelerate the retrofitting of buildings? We've got a lot of old buildings in Devon that are not very efficient, and how should we really fund these and incentivise people to make changes to their own houses where they're able to. What is the role of reducing road capacity in reducing traffic, and is it appropriate for Devon? Again, a lot of strong feelings around our roads and around ways that we might deal with traffic. Patrick's already flagged up the fact that what we eat, particularly meat and dairy, is something that the National Commission on Climate Change has made recommendations on. A 20% reduction in beef, lamb and dairy nationally is what they say we need. Obviously, we're a livestock farming county, and so this question is quite close to the heart of many citizens. So what does that actually mean for Devon? So we'd be really interested to see what the feeling in the room is. As Patrick says, we might have to focus on some of the issues in order to give them adequate time for quality discussion. So we're going to ask you a difficult thing right now, and that is to choose 3 that you would most like to be discussed.
Emily, can I just point out that the results of the poll will not determine the issues that are discussed in the Assembly, but they will feed into our thinking, because we obviously, this question is going out to everybody who responds to the public consultation on the plan, but we are interested in hearing back what you have to say and which should be the priority areas.
Yeah, that's really important. It's this is not a lasting and binding poll.
No, but it is informative. It'll be really interesting to see where people want to prioritize the effort.
Sorry to butt in, but I can't read anything other than how should Devon achieving net zero and beneficial to their special. All the other options are completely blank.
You should be able to scroll up and down with your mouse or cursor.
I can see the tick boxes, but I can't see half the text. How should Devon blank for the rest of it, and then achieving net zero and are beneficial to their special whatevers. Then the next boxes, next 5 boxes down the screen, nothing alongside them at all. I've noticing this in the chat as well, that there's lines missing out of the chat as people are putting in their input. I think it's a problem with Zoom.
Sorry to hear that, Chris. Are you able to put your cursor on the side of the window to find some lateral arrows pop up and expand the window? Most people in the, well, a couple of people in the chat are saying it is working okay. If not, Chris, get in touch with us afterwards and we can make sure we hear your opinion on it.
Well, we can also share the slides afterwards and the recording.
Yeah, so if you see an issue which isn't in these top 6, then please share it with us, both tonight and in the formal consultation. There's no particular reason why this is a complete list of the challenging topics that the Citizens' Assembly could be considering. So by all means, that's what we're doing here tonight, and make your suggestions. Thank you.
So we've got about 60 people out of the 86 that are on the call have voted. So, well, they're coming in thick and fast now.
I mean, there is a lot more information about these topics in the carbon plan. So we're kind of rushing to the final bit here, but please do read up on them, and you should find all of the information about the details in the document itself.
So you've got 30 seconds if you haven't placed your votes. Okay, I'm going to end polling now. So I'm sharing the results now. So interestingly, the most popular topic for discussion is on what the 20% reduction in beef, lamb and dairy consumption, the national target, means for Devon. And then what is the role of reducing road capacity and what is appropriate for Devon? And after that, how should Devon's landscapes evolve in ways that positively support achieving net zero and are beneficial to their special qualities? So yeah, really interesting to see some gaining almost 20% more votes than others. But as we said, this is not binding, and there's plenty of time during the consultation to give us your more detailed feedback in the consultation form. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the results now. And my colleague Doug has been keeping an eye on the chat for questions.
Yes, I have. Good evening, everybody. Brilliant to see all the feedback coming through the chat. The idea is that I've been trying to synthesize some of your questions into some themes that we can ask the panel. There are a couple of procedural questions that we can answer quite quickly. Emily, I'm going to give you two, Emily, regarding the Assembly. The first one is from Mike Walton. What's the rationale for an interim plan and then a final plan? And then a question, it's from Mike again, actually, is how will the Assembly members be selected?
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned briefly, we were hoping to do the Citizens' Assembly and then publish the plan, but the somewhat unexpected pandemic has thrown some surprises in, and we didn't want to keep Devon's public waiting until all of this settled down and we could hold a Citizens' Assembly. So in the meantime, we've drafted this plan based on the evidence gathering and the almost 900 submissions of public suggestions that we'd already received. And we've indicated which issues we think still ought to go to the Citizens' Assembly. And so we will now hold the Citizens' Assembly next summer and add in actions based on the deliberation of the Citizens' Assembly to form the final plan. With regards to who will be selected and how for the Citizens' Assembly, as Patrick described, we've taken advice from Exeter University, who have done a review of evidence of best practice of how Citizens' Assemblies are conducted and best work. And we will send out many letters, I believe thousands, across Devon, and then based on the responses we'll be able to select a group of people that represent the demographics of Devon, so a balance of representation of rural and urban, different ages, different occupations, things like that. The exact sampling method's not pinned down yet, but you can see the research paper on Citizens' Assembly on our website if you want to know a bit more about the procedure.
But Emily, can I just add that it won't just be the people who want to be on it. We're going to try and recruit a good cross-section. So some people maybe who aren't very engaged with climate change normally or wouldn't normally take part in these kind of events. So we are really going to try and reach a broad cross-section so that it's as representative as possible of the kinds of people who live across the county in different kinds of areas and do different kinds of things. That's the aim that we've set ourselves to achieve.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. You won't be able to put yourself forward to be on the Citizens' Assembly. You'll have to be invited. Yeah,
and then it's about seeing who's available and is able to attend all of the sessions that are on particular dates. So that's the reason for maybe kind of finding out who, contacting an awful lot of people and then making the final selection on the basis of those practical considerations closer to the time.
Okay, thank you all. So some more sort of pithy questions that have been coming along. There's some questions around the date. for when Devon should be striving for net zero. So to group some questions together, it's what power does the partnership have to lobby for an earlier date with government? And if Devon does go for an earlier date, what are the challenges to achieving that ahead of a national timetable? I don't know who on the panel would like to get stuck into that.
Can I say something about the date first of all? Because actually for me, and then I'll let Patrick talk more officially on part of the task. But to me, I think the date's a bit of a red herring. For example, in the Scottish one, we've not got a date at all, because the reason it's a red herring is because we need to start acting now. And the trouble with dates, or whether it's 2035 or 2040 or 2050, is people always look at the date. They always look at things in that distant future. The next 5 years are the critical thing. So we need to create a climate where people want to act now, they see opportunities and they move. Many of the changes we're going to be bringing in are not linear. They're more likely to be exponential. So it's really difficult to work out the time. So I think getting fixated about a year date actually skews the debate. I don't know if Patrick agrees, but I think that it's a problem for all of the debate that happens around how fast we move. We need to start moving now and moving fast.
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I agree. I think the sense of urgency is more important than whether we choose a particular date in the 2040s. I would just like to reassure everybody on this webinar, though, that we did discuss this point across the task force and across the emergency response at great length, because we realized that there are some people out there who are highly impatient to try and bring it as early as possible forward, and I totally understand that. At the same time, we commissioned research by the Centre for Energy Environment at the University of Exeter to crunch some numbers and to look at the Climate Change Committee's projections into the future. And the fact is that there are a lot of structural changes that need to happen, and when those changes happen will determine when the UK and Devon is able to reach net zero. And of course, the concept of net zero itself is a little bit slippery, because you know, is it 90% emissions reductions or 95% or 80%? So I think there are a lot of complexities in this, which led us to, I think, take the position that we did, which is 2050 at the very latest, but as early as is feasible. And of course, that feasibility then is something to do with how quickly society responds and Devon responds. So maybe the urgency issue and taking big decisions now is really key here, as Iain has mentioned.
So I just want to highlight that this is a particular question of the consultation. So we would really like to hear what, once you've read the challenges that we outline in the plan for why different dates are challenging for different reasons, and would put some costs on 2050 versus 2040, and so do dig into the detail and let us know what you think.
Okay, thank you all. Perhaps a question for Emily is, what are the DSOG partners doing themselves to reduce their own emissions to show leadership?
Great, thank you. So part of the declaration was that all the partners who signed the Declaration of Climate Emergency had to review their own organisational emissions and make plans to reduce them. And so they have been doing so. And they have agreed that they think that organisations ought to be net zero by 2030, because they think that it's more feasible for organisations to become net zero ahead of the national target than for a whole geography. We try and share updates of what partners are doing through the website on a regular basis. So do sign up for the newsletter or check out the website to hear about the practical things that they're doing.
Great, thank you, Emily. A question from Nicola Corrigan. Does the panel think there should be personal carbon allowances?
Patrick, I'm going to let you start with that one.
Ooh. Well, I mean, in some senses, I'm sympathetic to this because it's a natural end of the discussion about equity. But at the same time, I think you get into very slippery terrain about monitoring and measuring every single individual's behavior every day, and in some way logging that, and then you know, what are we going to do? Try and devise a series of punitive measures if people overconsume, or set up some kind of marketplace where I can trade my excess consumption with your. So I think it raises a lot of practical questions which have been around for a while and haven't been substantially resolved. So my gut feeling is that it's too far at this stage, but I think what we can do is to clarify, you know, to put some numbers on it and try and mobilize the use of carbon footprint tools so that people at least can get some idea of the numbers and the implications of the relative value of deciding not to fly to the United States for a holiday versus going vegan for 6 months. So people actually have a firm idea of the numbers behind those different choices that they're making in their lives. And to be honest, I think that's more important in the short term. And then maybe targeting high consumption individuals, frequent flyers, etc., as far as we can, and just try to change social norms. I think that's more important in the short term.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would worry around climate shaming and getting into this kind of tit for tat thing about I've done more than you and things like that. But I think the positive, you know, sending a positive message about what change, the opportunities change will bring. You know, I think the more we get people on side and moving collectively is the key here, rather than separating out.
Okay, thank you, panel. Some interesting questions around inequality. So particularly from David B and Anthony Adams. We have a stark inequality in our communities. How can action on the climate emergency help with social justice? How can poorer communities get involved?
I think personally, this is one of the real areas where we have got a lot to win. I mean, there's a huge issue around fuel poverty. There's a huge issue around food waste and food poverty in certain parts of our county. And I think that in many respects, one of the things that the climate emergency is going to do is shine a light onto some of this. And now they do have carbon emission implications, but I think broadly what we're talking about, and it came up, there's a few in the chat really, is about increasing general well-being. It's raising the standards of general well-being through some of these climate actions. And I think that's the most exciting win-wins that I can see in this.
I mean, Iain, I could just add that there will be economic opportunities from decarbonising our society. So it isn't just about taking things away from people, it's also about enabling people to do new kinds of service provision, new kinds of economic action. So there's a lot of excitement around that across the task force, and in particular those interested in the business sector and the economy in particular. So you know, for example, just looking at one aspect, the need to retrofit houses on a mass scale to increase insulation, reduce energy consumption, install heat pumps, etc. You know, it's a very good time to decide to become an electrician or a plumber or somebody who can be involved in that kind of service provision. So there are enormous opportunities for economic job creation, etc., through this, if we can mobilize it effectively and take advantage of them.
And I just add another thing on there, which is, you know, some of the best wind in our coastal waters is off the southwest, and the technology for floating wind, because the sea is too deep there for kind of seabed thing, but the technology of floating wind is now here. So a lot of people are thinking that southwest corridor could be a really fantastic area for offshore floating wind, which would require us to start a whole new industry in the southwest to kind of support that.
Could I just add to that there are some really exciting things going on in Devon already around housing. For example, we've got some pilots of some whole house retrofitting going on, supported by local authorities, that is trying to develop models where occupants don't have to pay upfront for improvements, and landlords are supported to find cost-effective ways of improving the energy efficiency and therefore reducing the energy bills of housing. And there's some exciting new builds in the pipeline as well from community land trusts, and so there's an exciting project of social housing by Plymouth Energy Community. So there's lots already bubbling away.
Okay, thank you, panel. A question from Barry Lunt. What's the role of farm subsidies in net zero?
Do you want me to have a go at that? Or it's got a very important role. So obviously Brexit is going ahead, and we're moving away from the EU farm subsidy system, the Common Agricultural Policy, and we're moving towards the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is already being trialled in Devon, and there's feedback being given on various trials with it. But we outline in the plan the significant opportunities that it offers, because it's moving to reward the provision of environmental goods and public goods, such as, for instance, where changes might reduce flooding or increase tree cover and things like that. So there's big opportunities that are becoming clearer as the scheme becomes clearer for farmers to be rewarded for doing things that will help reduce, well, it will help draw down emissions and reduce agricultural emissions.
Thanks, Emily. Did Iain or Patrick wish to come in on that issue?
No, not specifically, no.
No.
Only to say that the economic incentives that are available to us must be consistent with the climate change goals. If we're going to have any chance of reaching net zero, perverse incentives for actions that increase emissions, you know, we really have to address that as a society and locally as much as we can as well.
Okay, perhaps another question for Emily is how are we going to monitor the implementation of the plan?
So the section 12 of the plan outlines a proposal for monitoring. Obviously there's a lot more detail to be developed, but it basically implies some potential sort of key performance indices or metrics that could help measure the outcomes. And as Patrick said, a lot of the data is coming down from national data and has to be apportioned to Devon. So there's a little bit of looking at the data that's already available and also working out where additional data might need to be gathered. But do take a look at section 12 if you want to look at the detail of that.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I think in terms of time, we should probably move on. Would that be right, Emily?
Yeah, we need a few minutes just to signpost a few next steps.
Emily, just before you do that, isn't it worth saying that we are able to record all of the statements in the chat so we can take them forward? They're not a substitute for official responses to the public consultation on the document, but they won't disappear, so we can take them into account and make sure that none of these sentiments are forgotten in the process.
Yes, definitely. I will be collating them and feeding them into the Net Zero Task Force for consideration. Great, so I think Hannah was going to come in and pick up on the next steps.
Thank you. Yeah, so we would really like you to read the plan, which is available on our website. PDF versions will be available very soon to download. And we'd like you to go ahead and give your feedback on the consultation online and share this through your networks. And we'd also really like to encourage you to attend some of our thematic webinars, which we're holding over the next 10 weeks or so, so you can learn more about the plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Now, one of the questions that's come in is, when is the deadline for responding to this consultation? And I think it's at the end of February. Emily, is that correct?
It's the 15th of February, so it's mid-February.
Okay, so you've got until the 15th of February to log official responses, as Emily mentioned, and that can be done in a variety of ways, online and offline, depending on what suits you best. And you can engage with this document in multiple ways as well, both online and offline. So I think there's been some chat about a PDF, etc. Okay, it's pretty much 8 o'clock. I'm sure that people have got other things to do with their evening as well. So I really just want to thank you. We've got over 85 people on the call. I know some of them are task force members, so I'd like to thank them for tuning in as well, and for everybody who's engaged this evening by asking questions and responding to the polls. I'm absolutely convinced that this process will not be a success unless everybody gets stuck in and gets involved. And we have a huge challenge. There are 1.2 million people living in Devon, and we need to try and make everybody aware of this plan and this process and try and play a role in reducing emissions in the future. That's not going to happen very easily, but if we all try and spread the word across our networks as best we can over the next few months, that will really help. And I think the Citizens' Assembly itself will generate a lot of publicity. So I'd like to thank Professor Iain Stewart from the University of Plymouth for taking the time to share his thoughts and expertise today, and obviously to Doug and Hannah and Emily from Devon County Council and the Devon Climate Emergency Response team for doing so much hard work behind the scenes to try and make all this happen. Thank you very much.